Chapter 23 The Rifle. The wolves returned the very next morning. Shortly after dawn, they left through the trees and started chasing a poor calf through the pasture. Roz managed to drive them off, but that night they returned again. The herd came stampeding into the barn as the wolves laughed and trotted back to the fields. The cows were in shock. They refused to leave the barn. If this continued, the herd would produce less milk, the farm would lose money, and Mr. Sharif would send Roz back to the factory. Something had to be done. Knock, knock, knock. The dog barked, and the children opened the door. "How'd you get all those scrapes?" said Jay. "Is everything okay?" said Jad. "I must speak with your father," said Roz. Mr. Sharif came to the door, and Roz explained the problem. At the first mention of wolves, he sent his children to their rooms, but the dogs stayed. Oscar had no idea what the man and the robot were discussing, and his tail wagged happily wagged as he stood beside them. However, his tail stopped wagging when Mr. Sharif handed Roz a rifle. The dog had seen the rifle in action, and it frightened him to his core. He scurried into the bushes and hid there, whimpering while the conversation went on. "What do you mean, you can't fire a rifle?" the man yelled. "Roz, you're a farmer now, and sometimes farmers have to kill animals." This was the first time Mr. Sharif had ever yelled at Roz. She waited patiently as words and spittle flew out from his mouth. "My farm and my family are in danger. Roz, I order you to kill those wolves." "I cannot follow that order because I am not programmed to be violent." Mr. Sharif let out a huge sigh. He knew Roz was right, but when he reached for the weapon, she couldn't let go. The man stared at the robot. The robot stared at the dog. The dog stared at the rifle. Oscar was still whimpering and hiding in the bushes. Just the sight of the rifle had sent him into a panic. It was hard to believe that such a fearful animal was related to wolves. "The dogs are related to wolves," thought the robot, and her computer brain began buzzing with activity. She thought of dogs and wolves and rifles. She thought of Shadow, the wolf leader, and the long straight scar on his head. Then she had an idea. "Although I cannot fire the rifle," said Roz, "I believe it can help me solve the wolf problem." Mr. Sharif frowned. He didn't know what the robot was getting at, but she was happy to let her handle the wolves by herself. "First, try it your way," he said. "Just don't lose any of the cows, or else we might have to lose the robot too." Chapter 24 The Bluff. The cows peered out of the barn at Roz. The robot was holding her rifle. She carried it to the far side of the pasture and placed it by her feet. Then she began coating herself with mud and grass, and probably a little cow dung. When every inch of her body was concealed, she nested into the ground and became a part of the landscape, an ordinary clump of grass. "Is she all right? Where'd she go?" Roz had learned to camouflage herself back on the island. Now she was using that trick once again. She sat motionless for hours, waiting for the wolves to appear. Daylight faded and the stars came out and the moon climbed into the sky, but the wolves didn't show. So Roz tried something new. The robot was an excellent mimic, and she began crying out in the sound of a wounded calf. "Please help me," she cried. "I have hurt my leg and I can't not move." Crickets chirped. "Please help me." An owl hooted. "I could not move." The calf's voice continued flying out. Finally, as the moon dipped behind the trees, 7 wolves slunk into the pasture. Shadow led the way, silently stalking through the night. Covered in dark fur, he was practically invisible. Only his long, pale scar gave him away. Nose sniffed, eyes searched, ears listened. Then the clump of grass began rustling. "There," whispered Shadow. "The calf is hiding in that tall grass." "Something feels wrong to me, Shadow," said a female wolf. "This is too easy." "I make the decisions, Barb." Dumped the wolf leader. "Slash, lurk, fang, circle around and wait for my signal." The 3 wolves dashed off. When they were in position, Shadow gave the signal, and his pack closed in on the wounded calf. With every step, the grass rustled more and more until the ground seemed to be moving. And then the ground really was moving. Grass and dirt crumbled aside, and there was the robot standing tall and pointing the rifle at the robot leader. The pack froze. "Hello, Shadow," growled the robot. "My name is Roz. I see from your scar you are familiar with rifles. You have been shot at before. You know what will happen if I pull this trigger. Reader, you and I are well aware that our robot was not programmed to be violent. Roz couldn't have pulled that trigger if she wanted to, but she didn't want to do this. She was bluffing. Of course, Shadow didn't know any of this. As far as the wolf knew, he was defeated. And so he did what wolves do when they're defeated. He laid out and cowered before the robot. For the first time anyone could recall, the wolf leader looked weak. I do not want to hurt any wolves, Ross continued, but if you return to this farm, I will have no choice. Now please leave and never come back. Shadow scrambled away with his tail between his legs. Barb was close behind him, followed by the other wolves, and soon the entire pack has disappeared into the night. Spring, Chapter 25, the summer. Spring melted into summer, and the wolves were nowhere to be seen. Perhaps Ross had scared off the pack for good, or perhaps the heat was keeping away. You see, it was the hottest time of the year on the farm. The sun was scorching, and the fields were baking, and the pond was drying up, and foul odors were floating all throughout the dairy. Without dry spells, the farm's powerful sprayers were activated. During dry spells. Water shot out in long, misty arcs, and the land turned deeper shades of green. When the hayfields were lush and ready to be harvested, Roz fired up the mower and the baler. The giant machines rolled out of the shed and down the long driveway. Shortly afterwards, they rolled back in, leaving bales of hay strewn across the stubbly fields. The cows and the humans spent hot days indoors. Only when the sun set and the air began to cool would they venture outside. The herd strolled out to graze under the stars. The children ran out to chase fireflies, and sometimes even Mr. Sharif stepped outside to stretch his stiff legs. Trees swished in the evening breeze. Heat lightning flickered on the horizon. Chickadees sang their summer songs. When Roz wasn't farming, she was searching for a way to escape. Everything hinged on the children. The robot needed their help, but she couldn't bring herself to tell them the truth. It was still too risky. Mr. Sharif asked the children not to distract Roz from their work, but they did it anyway. They sneaked out of the house and ordered the robot to play with them. Together, they told stories, rode bicycles, lay on the grass, and watched fluffy clouds drift by. Summer was tornado season. On occasion, thick clouds would start funneling downward, reaching for the ground. So far, the funnel clouds had all receded back into the sky before doing any damage, but it was only a matter of time before a tornado touched down. Chapter 26. The Tornado. The weather forecast warned of possible tornadoes that day, but despite their scientific experiment, experts still couldn't predict exactly when or where the tornado would strike. So most farmers carried on with their usual tasks while keeping a watchful eye on the skies. Roz was out in the field loading hay bales onto the flatbed truck as towering, puffy clouds rose up from the south. Raindrops lightly tapped against her body, and she thought nothing of it. The wind began to blow, and still the robot continued with her work. It wasn't until the first flash of lightning that Roz finally called it quits. She climbed into the back of the truck, and it automatically rolled across the hayfield toward the driveway. The storm developed quickly. Dark clouds were swirling and bulging downward, lower and lower, like a giant twisting finger pointing at the countryside. A tornado was beginning to form. Oh no, I hope it doesn't touch down. When the truck reached the driveway, Roz hollered, "Drive faster!" The engine revved, and the tires kicked up gravel, and the robot held on tight. The funnel cloud continued stretching downward. It brushed the tree line, and leaves exploded into the air. I think this is a tornado. Uh-oh. Dust whirled around and around, rising higher with every spin. Then the tornado touched the ground. Oh yeah, definitely a tornado. A siren sounded in the distance, but the tornado was growing noisier and angrier as it blew in the fields, and the siren was quickly lost to the howling winds. The truck charged up the driveway and into a cluster of farm buildings. Roz looked ahead at the house and saw frightened faces in the window. "Go to the storm shelter," she hollered in her loudest voice. Then she leapt off the truck and ran to help the Sharif. Leaves and snakes flew sideways, whipping against the robot's body, knocking her off balance. Behind her, the farm buildings rattled and groaned. The milking parlor was shaking violently. With a long, terrible screech, its entire roof peeled off and sailed away with the wind. 4 blurry shapes appeared in the backyard. Mr. Sharif shielded his face and hobbled alongside the house toward the storm shelter. He threw open the door and waved everyone downstairs. Oscar went first, then Jaya, but Jad was moving. "Come on, Jad," yelled his father. The boy stood still, shaggy hair flying everywhere, and stared up at the towering, twisting tornado. He used to have nightmares about tornadoes, but this was no nightmare. It was real, and it was getting closer. The clouds whirled faster. The wind roared louder. The trees bent down to the ground. Jad suddenly felt strong arms reaching around him, and Roz whisked him to safety. Mr. Sharif reached up from inside the shelter, desperately grasping for his son. And just when Roz thrust the boy into the father's arms, a blast of wind slammed the shelter door closed and swept our robot away. At first, Roz didn't realize she was in the tornado. She kept expecting to fall back to the ground. But the wind only lifted her higher and higher. She saw treetops and rooftops and far-away fields. Most of the countryside came into view with every spin around the funnel cloud. Our robot's survival instincts were blaring in her head, urging her to protect herself. But what could she do? The tornado was in control. The winds whirled around her, up and around. Roz could almost imagine what it would be like to fly, and she thought of Rayville. It seemed her final moments would be spent in her son's airborne world. Roz wasn't the only thing swept away in the storm. Dust, gravel, leaves, benches, fence posts, and farm equipment were all swirling around her, with her. The robot was pelted by flying objects, big and small. She never saw the shovel coming. The heavy tool wheeled around the tornado and clang! It hit the back of her head. Everything suddenly went dark, while Roz was still in the sky. Chapter 27, The Broken Robot. The Sharifs found their robot powered off, laying in a ditch by the road. Her left leg was crumpled beneath her torso. Her right arm was twisted around a tree trunk, and her whole body was covered in new scrapes and dents. Together, the family heaved Roz into the bed of a pickup truck where Oscar was waiting. The dog sniffed her broken body while the Sharifs climbed in beside her. Then Rambler turned around. The road was littered with debris of the storm, and the truck had to drive slowly. As they bounced along, Jad pressed the button on the back of Roz's head. She powered up, and her garbled voice said automatically, "Hello, I am Roz Zoom Unit 7134, but you may call me Roz." Oscar licked the poor robot's face, and Jad leaned in close. "Roz, can you hear me? Are you okay?" Hello, Jad. I have broken limbs and minor damage to my computer brain. My sensors are now repairing themselves. Please stand by." The robot's glowing eyes pulsed as her recovery program did its job. Before long, Roz sounded like her old self. "My computer brain is now fully functional." Jad wrapped his arms around the robot and sobbed. "I'm so sorry, Roz. It's my fault. The tornado got you. Please don't be mad." Now Jaya was crying. She pulled her brother and her dog and the robot into a big hug. Mr. Sharif wasn't much of a hugger. but he reached over and laid his hand